Hello, and welcome to the People Who Read People podcast, hosted by me, Zach Elwood. In this episode, we'll be talking about the sport of fencing with guest Seth Baldwin. This episode was recorded on March 8th, 2019. Topics we'll talk about include some basic rules of fencing, the competitive edges that experienced fencers can have, and some thoughts on reading opponents and predicting behavior. Along the way, we will talk a little bit about poker because Seth also likes to play some poker. Just a quick note, if you do enjoy the People Who Read People podcast, please consider giving it a rating and review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'd appreciate that a lot. And if you're a poker player and want to learn more about how to read poker tells, you can check out my books on Amazon. Just search for poker tells on there and you'll see them. And if you've got any ideas for interesting people to interview about how they use human behavior in their profession or pastime, just let me know. Get in touch with me using my contact page, readingpokertells.com/contact, or get in touch with me on Twitter at @apokerplayer. How's it going, Seth?
It's going great. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on here. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
Okay, so first I guess we should start with a little bit about what's your background in fencing and your experience.
So I started fencing as a freshman in college at the University of Michigan, and trained seriously. Right after college, I actually moved to Portland from college in order to continue training fencing. And eventually I studied under the famous American fencer and coach, Michael Marks. He was a 3-time U.S. Olympian, and he coached numerous Olympians underneath him. And in 2004, I had my best year ever. I finished 10th in the country in the national rankings for the year, making me, I guess, 7th alternate for the Olympic team. So I guess if the whole Olympic team ran off a cliff in a bus, they would call me. And I finished 3rd at the national championships that year, which is my best personal result.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds impressive to me. And we know each other through poker. You play some poker too, right?
Yeah. I mean, so the next year, I guess 2005, I tore my ACL playing soccer with some friends. And so while I was rehabbing my leg and convalescing after surgery, I started playing some poker home games. I mean, poker was big on TV, and I enjoyed poker right away, read every book I could read on it at the time. And I've basically been playing home game poker once or twice a week ever since.
Yeah, and I should say, I initially, when I put out the question on Facebook to get ideas for sports-related talks I could have, interviews I could do, Seth responded, and he had some interesting ideas about, reading people and predicting behavior in fencing, and he kind of made some analogies to poker, so I thought he'd be an interesting person to talk to. So that's a little bit more context. So before we get to some of the behavioral and movement prediction type stuff, I thought it'd be good to cover some kind of basics about fencing, because I realized when I set this up, I realized I was pretty ignorant about the sport of fencing overall. I had some rough ideas, but I was very ignorant. So I think it'd be good to go over a few questions for the audience, because a lot of people, I bet, are not that experienced, don't know much about fencing. So I'll ask a few basic questions.
Sure, of course.
How does a fencing match usually work? How many individual little bouts are there, and how does that structure usually work?
So typically a fencing tournament is sort of like the World Cup of soccer, where you have a group stage and you have to fight everybody in your group to get promoted to the knockout stage. And then it's single elimination pretty much all the way up from there. The main difference is that fencing tournaments are usually pretty big. They're like 1 to 300 people. And so the group stage matches, usually there's groups of 6 or sometimes 7. And those are first 1 to 5 touch wins. There's a 3-minute time limit. So whoever's ahead after 3 minutes is the winner. And then the knockout matches are first 1 to 15 wins. And there's sort of 3-minute rounds. So in the 9 minutes, whoever's ahead is the winner.
So we should say here, when you say wins, that's literally just touching the other opponent with the tip of your sword, right?
Well, so there's 3 different weapons. There's 3 different variants of fencing. There's foil, épée, and saber. And people usually specialize in one of the three and maybe sometimes dabble in another one for fun. And they all have different rules as to what you can strike with and where and when, which makes it confusing, and just adds to the confusion.
Right.
I fenced épée, which is the most straightforward of them all. Basically, you hit your opponent literally anywhere on the body, whenever you want. And if you hit them before they hit you, then you get a point. And the only complicating factor is that if you hit each other both within a 25th of a second, that's 40 milliseconds, then you both get a point.
Mm. And they use electronic, touch sensitivity things now. I mean, that's how they pretty much always do it for a tournament, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even for practice, there's tiny little wires that run down the length of the blade, and they end in a spring-loaded button that has to be able to push up about 1.5 pounds of force. And the strip that you fence on top of is conductive. It's metal. It's mesh. And likewise, the weapon has a metal bell guard to protect the hand. Is also conducts electricity. So if you hit the bell guard or you hit the ground, it doesn't register. But if you hit them literally anywhere on the body, then the light goes off.
Because I was thinking that it seems crazy to me that they used to try to judge that, or they used to judge that using judges, like actual judges. I mean, watching the footage, it's so quick. I can't imagine judges doing that accurately.
Certainly not. I mean, when I very first started fencing, we're all starving students in college, and so it wasn't uncommon to practice without electronic gear. And we would practice. You have a variety of field judges to try to help, determine whether the hit was good or not. And if you look historically, they would put chalk on the end of the weapon, or they would put dye. I mean, all sorts of stuff, historical stuff. But electronic épée has been around for, I think, close to 100 years, maybe.
Oh, okay. I didn't know it was so common. Like I assumed it was something for the bigger tournaments, and I didn't know it would be something you would have at the practice.
So foil and épée have a slightly different history. Foil and saber. Foil and saber distinguish between valid target and invalid target. So in foil, you have to land on the torso, and you have to distinguish between the torso and the arm or the leg. And so they do that by wearing a metallic vest that's a lame fabric. And likewise, saber is anywhere above the waist. So they have the same thing. And saber is also different because it doesn't require you to score with a tip. You can score with the edge and a slashing motion. So they have to electrify the whole blade, and they don't have a button at the end of it. So saber was actually really only electrified about 30 years ago.
Interesting. Okay. So that explains why I saw the guy Homer, who's a really well-known
Daryl Homer, sure.
fencer. Yeah, and he described saber as more ninja-like, and I guess that explains it. That you can hit with the sides and slash.
Yeah, you can slash. The saber is surprisingly the lightest of all three weapons. Épée is actually the heaviest, and in some ways the slowest.
I wouldn't have expected that.
Exactly, it's not intuitive at all. And the other thing about foil and saber is that they have right of way, which épée doesn't. And people argue back and forth whether right of way is good or bad. It's sort of like Protestants versus Catholics or whatever. But as a consequence, when you combine that, whoever starts the attack first is given the initiative, and the other person is obligated to make them miss or to defend the attack, and can't, has to delay their attack until they're done. With the fact, when you combine that with the fact that the saber you can touch anywhere and is also super light, it makes offense very hard to stop in saber. Saber people attack all the time because it's easier to attack than it is to defend. And in épée, because those requirements don't exist, you can hit on the arm sort of whenever you want. People start their attack and they actually get picked off on the arm on the way in. And so as a consequence, people love to counterattack in épée, and people actually don't like to attack that much. And so épée rewards defense somewhat more than offense. And then the bouts go the other way, where everyone is waiting around for the other guy to attack first and nothing happens. And saber, they just attack each other like maniacs and no one can tell what happened. So they both suffer from their own problems. And in some ways, foil is sort of in between the two. But in my opinion, I sort of tend to lump foil more with saber. And I mean, I'm biased because I fenced epee for 20 years, but
And you can cross feet in saber too, right? And is that a
no,
difference?
they changed the rules on that. It used to be that you could back in the day, but actually, while I was fencing, they changed the rule and said you cannot cross your feet.
Oh,
And so, because again, they're trying to slow down the attack, people,
uh-huh.
it's a very powerful attacking mechanism. Again, part because of the rule that you can only attack really people who are in front of you. And so, if you can run past your opponent, by rule, you're not really allowed to hit them anymore. And so, if you can cross your feet, they call that a flèche, Fleche. I guess some French term for arrow or something like a Fletcher. Um, you just shoot past them, and then they can't really hit you back anymore. So it's a very powerful offensive attack that launches you really quickly, and then doesn't leave you that vulnerable because of the rule that someone has to be in front of you to hit them.
So that explains those kind of stylistic lunges they do, where they don't cross. They're never crossing the feet. They just have to figure out a way to move forward very quickly without crossing feet.
Yeah, although even in foil and epee, the lunge is still faster over short distances. It just, if you really want to collapse a longer distance, the crossing the feet is more effective. But at a short distance, you can fire off a lunge faster. There's sort of less setup time for it.
Gotcha. So let's quickly cover some basic terms. We've, like attack and parry and feint. Can you give a quick definition for some of those that might not be obvious to listeners?
Well, I mean, they're all pretty much what you think they are. If your attack is you reach out your arm and you try to hit the person usually with a lunge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if someone's attacking you, you don't want them to hit you. You parry. You deflect their blade. The one key term I'll use that maybe people don't consider is what we'll call the disengage, which is if you're attacking me and you lunge to my chest and I don't want you to, I try to parry, which is I'm trying to engage your blade to deflect it, and you avoid my parry by disengaging and avoiding my hand and my blade and sort of slip, pummeling your tip around underneath my arm and up on, back to where it was roughly. And so that's sort of the standard way to evade my parry is called a disengage.
Mm.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you've got the
The
feint,
feint,
which
yeah,
probably a lot of people know that one too. But
sure. So if I can, feint my attack and get you to parry early, then I don't even need to disengage. I can just lunge. I can just lunge while you've already committed yourself to a big parry.
so it's
Or
kind of the fencing equivalent of a bluff is like saying you're going to go one way and then
yeah,
just quickly going the other way.
yeah, for sure. Also, especially in epee, people love to counterattack, and so I can feint my attack, draw your counterattack, and then counter your counterattack. That's super common in epee.
Mm-hmm. And what's the deal with the blades? One thing I often wonder is why they're so bendy.
They're bendy so to act as shock absorbers to absorb the blow of the strike. Otherwise, it's a lot of pressure. You don't want to literally
Oh
stab
yeah,
people, so they
right.
bend and they absorb the pressure so you don't hurt people.
So does having to adjust to the bendiness, like how they move around when you swing them or whatever, does that affect? You have to take that into account when you're.
Oh, absolutely. And there's sort of good and bad aspects of that. I mean, the bad aspect is if your blade is too floppy, is your tip will lag, and so you'll go to parry fast, and your tip sort of hasn't really gotten there yet.
Right. Yeah.
Or even if it does get there, it's too soft, and your opponent can just sort of outmuscle you because your blade's too soft. But the good part, though, is that people can flick. You go to attack, someone goes to parry, you can actually snap your fingers and whip the tip all the way around their parry and
Oh,
still hit them like a fish hook, almost like a
interesting.
casting
Okay.
your fishing rod or something. And
Hadn't
so
thought about that part of it.
foil is very bendy. Foil, they'll flick, even over the shoulder to hit you in the middle of your back on your shoulder blade.
Wow, it's like a
Epee,
whip.
yeah, absolutely. Epee is not as bendy; it's stiffer and a little bit heavier, but you can still bend it around the bell guard and hit them on the wrist or the thumb, even though they supposedly have their bell guard blocking your blade. So that's the good aspect of being bendy. But in general, I tried to find the stiffest but still lightest blade that I could on the market. Having a stiff blade just improves its response time and makes it a lot faster.
So one thing that struck me when I was watching some footage to prepare for the interview was just how fast the matches are. I had previously been imagining them, probably because I'd seen the most exciting ones. I imagined them lasting, quite like 10 seconds or something. But when you watch them, most of them are just over in a couple seconds.
Well,
And
individual actions are often over in a couple of seconds, and you're probably watching, saber matches, which maybe the whole match lasts 10 seconds. Uh, but in
oh,
epee matches often last the full 3 to 9 minutes.
but when you say match, like I'm just talking about the individual, like to get to the point of a hit.
Oh, the actual action, the
Yeah,
strike. No,
the
yeah,
actual actions. Yeah,
they are there. It's like a cobra strike. I mean, it's
right.
the end, the tip of a fencing sword is the second fastest object in sports after bullets and pistol shooting.
Yeah, so it just seems like those can happen so quickly. Like a lot of the points end with just a couple seconds. Somebody lunges forward. They both lunge at the same time. Somebody moves around and does their lunge. It's just so quick. So that was the main surprise to me, was just how quick it was. It just seems like it's it must just be for any sport. It must just be one of the fastest series of decision making of any. It must be top of the sports. Would you agree with that? Like as far as like
I
the
I
fastest points of
would.
decision?
It is crazy fast, and most casual observers, literally have no idea what happened, and
Right.
and fencing on TV, they they've hired some ex fencers to try to explain it, but really, I think fencing is still suffering from having not yet found their czar of the telestrator, like Mike Fratello was for basketball. They really need somebody who can really break down the fencing action and can really explain the strategy for him. You'd be
Yeah.
the John Madden, say, and here you went, bam, and sit him up there, bam, or whatever.
Right.
Have some
Right.
gimmick. I
Slow
don't know.
motion. Yeah.
The
Yeah. Definitely. It might be less audience friendly than poker even.
it's a close. It's pretty for opposite reasons. But yes, one's slow, nothing
Right.
happens,
So
and the other is
fast.
too
Yeah.
fast, and you
Exactly.
still can't tell what happened.
Yeah.
But it's true. And yet somehow, despite being so audience unfriendly, and certainly, I mean, my mom can definitely attest. She never enjoyed going to any of my fencing matches as a kid or whatever. Fencing has really grown in the U.S. I've been impressed by how much bigger the fencing tournaments are now than they used to be. How much better the Americans are now than they used to be. They're
Oh, really?
they're
Wow.
having a lot of international success now. When 30 years ago, American fencers did barely nothing internationally. Um,
Interesting. Okay. I didn't know that. I was going to ask about popularity. So
but it's
that's
still a very
interesting to know.
small niche sport for sure. Um, but I think fencing is starting to pick up some popularity in part because, I could be wrong, but not too long ago, someone did analysis you know of college athletic scholarships, and basically concluded that if you wanted to earn one, your best chance was to join a fencing club. That
Huh.
just because there's so few
Well,
fencers, your
right.
ratio is a
Right.
lot higher than if you tried to play basketball or whatever.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. Less competition. Yeah. Good niche to get into maybe for some people.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, so let's get into the. We'll talk a little bit about the role luck or variance has in fencing, and then we'll talk some more about behavioral kind of things. So I guess first, how do you see the role of luck or variance playing in fencing? To phrase it differently, how often would a very experienced fencer beat a fairly beginner level fencer?
Well,
What's
if
the
there's
role
that
skill played?
that much difference in skill, the very experienced fencer is just going to crush that person and basically never lose.
Right.
Um,
So does that mean they would like, as far as individual points, like would they be getting how many points do you have to get to win a match?
a knockout stage match, you have to get to 15.
So would it be like they beat them like 15 to 0? Those kinds of things are possible.
The other person would probably score a few, so like 15 to
Uh huh.
3. The other
Right. But
person who's already up by 10, they might, grow lazy and not try as hard.
a
But
pretty inexperienced amateur player is gonna you never pretty much never beat a very experienced player on the the whole match
no, no,
tournament.
never.
Yeah.
But
Right.
with a smaller amount of skill difference, there is a medium amount of variance, and again, the different weapons have different degrees of variance, baked into them. Epee actually has the most variance, and if you're the less experienced fencer, you'll actually try to increase the variance by keeping the score low. Like you'd be happy just to let time expire 0-0 and then go to overtime
Uh,
for sudden death and take your chances, as a 60-40 dog for one touch than a 60-40 dog over 25 touches or whatever.
Yeah, so it's like the poker equivalent of like shoving all in pre-flop to
Yeah,
to decrease the other person's
exactly. Like long ball versus small ball. Daniel Negreanu talks about small ball, and who was it? Gordon.
Right.
Gordon, talked about just
Phil
Gordon. Thank you. Yeah, talked about just getting it all in and push and pray.
Right. Yeah, if you're outclassed,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
Yeah, same kind of thing.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit before the podcast. We were talking about how you thought you saw some similarities to the game theory optimal approach of rock paper scissors and fencing. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that?
Sure. I mean, even more. I mean, game theory optimal is maybe sort of a misnomer, and fencers are always trying to exploit each other. So, only if both people are really at a high level and evenly matched, then you'll see something approximating GTO as we commonly talk about it, where people randomly mix up their actions and counteractions, and those matches are usually fairly close as a consequence. But if there's any kind of if there's any kind of skill difference, the better fencer can see what the other fencer is doing and exploit that, either based on tendencies or based on real-time information. And so that's where maybe some distinctions are worth making, and definitely where I know some big difference between fencing and poker. In fencing, if you want to attack somebody, you have to move to attack them. You have to propel your body forward as fast as you're able and poke them. And some people can do that faster than others due to athleticism. Some people can do it smoother than others due to practice. Some people who are amateurs, they have like a hitch or a wind up, or their arm catches, or they try to punch you or something, all things that are inefficient. But in poker, everyone can more or less put their chips out in them, or say all in and not even move it hardly. There's no real physical action hardly required to bluff. I mean, a tiny bit, but not much. And so in poker,
definitely very different.
So in poker, you're looking for other types of tells that aren't necessarily tied to the act of betting. I mean, obviously, do people throw their chips out fast? Are they aggressive? But maybe you're looking at other things like how much they talk, or whether they seem happy or relaxed. I mean, other things that aren't required for betting. And so in fencing,
poker's so I mean, fencing is like any sport, entirely physical. So we're looking at physical things all the time.
Sure. But
poker's so minorly physical.
But there are non-physical tells also, though. I mean, for example, let's say I lunge and my opponent tries to parry, but they're just a little bit late, and so my attack still gets there, and they're just a hair late with their parry, and I score. And they go back to their on-guard line for the next touch, and they're mad at themselves, and like they slap themselves on the leg, which is like a common, thing that you'll see fencers do from time to time. Well, that's actually a tell that they're mad at themselves for not getting that parry in time. That they're going to want to parry even faster the next time that attack presents itself. And not only that, but that smacking themselves on the leg is raising their excitation level, so that they're going to jump really, really early as soon as they see that stimulus again. So now is the perfect time to go feint, disengage. You show that same attack, they're going to parry really early. You just come around to see you come around the other side and nail them with the disengage. And so there's
some metagame consideration.
Yeah, but there's a tell that's not part of the act of attacking or defending. They've slapped themselves and they're mad at themselves in between the touches. And so there are tells, there are metagame tells like that. And then there's the tell that we're talking about of real-time assessment. They're starting their attack, but their attack is just too slow. You see it. Or they're starting their attack, but their attack isn't smooth. It has a hitch, or it has a telegraph of some kind. And you see it while they throw. So, in rock, paper, scissors, I remember there was a robot, some team invented that used machine vision to try to see, as you shot your rock, paper, scissors throw, which way you were going. And we would try to counter that real time on your throw.
Right.
And so
feature at that very last second.
Yeah. And so a lot of what fencing is, but when people are evenly matched and they're both fast, you don't have enough time to see it real time as much. And so you have to start guessing based on other metagame considerations, what their tendencies are, what they did last time, what you succeeded at last time. You try to level your opponent. Are they a first level thinker? Are they a second level thinker? Those sorts of things.
So do you, and like you said, if you thought, say you thought you were like completely evenly matched, would you just at that point, say you didn't think the other person had exploitable tendencies at all, would you just switch up, things you knew were good approaches, good strategies, and just like randomly switch them up every time? Like, this time I'm going to try this time I'm going to try this. And I mean, I guess a lot of it's like once you get into it, it's your instinct takes over. But do you think there's that conscious thought of like, I'm just going to try a lot of different approaches?
Absolutely.
Switch up.
The key is to not be predictable. And so as soon as you do an action a couple of times, you feel like it might be time to switch it up. Also, a lot of fencing is sort of trying to surprise your opponent. So you'll establish a rhythm, hope that they think that rhythm is a tell for you, and then surprise them. So when they try to exploit you, you're exploiting their exploitation. There's a lot of sort of first and second level.
Must be so many levels. Yeah. I mean, I'd imagine it's just kind of instinctual after you practice so much to like, all that stuff's in your head that, you have all these instinctual, like back and forth kind of things automatically in your physical memory. But yeah, it just seems like there's so many little levels to it at such a micro scale too,
Yeah.
It's interesting.
My wife and I took a ballroom dancing class, and she did not appreciate my element of surprise at all. As it was my job to lead. I would never telegraph where we were going to go or when, and she found it very difficult to follow. And needless to say, we didn't go back. So
they might appreciate the predictability in that one.
Yeah, some telegraphing and some heads up as to what move we're doing.
I'm going to stay unreadable. Yeah.
Well, being unreadable is very important. I have a lot more practice fencing than I do ballroom dance. Let's leave it at that.
So you had a good quote that I should mention here before we talked. When we talked a couple days ago, your direct quote was, "Most of fencing practice revolves around the arms race of discerning real attacks from feints while making your own feints look more like your attacks." So basically, talking about that really balanced approach of like, you want to combine your movements so your opponent can't tell one from the other.
Yeah, and so a lot of that's just delivery, physical execution. But also then reading the subtle differences in how your opponent presents themselves. Is their attack have commitment behind it or not? And so all fencing coaches, but especially my most influential fencing coach, Michael Marks. That's how he would structure most of practice, and most of the individual lessons that he gave was to how to discern what your opponent is doing and react correctly in a split second. You talked about fencing being fast. Those 40 milliseconds between a double touch and a single touch in épée sounds like nothing to most people, but after 10 years of fencing, seemed like a long time to me. Like I could tell even before the lights went off whether it was a single or a double, and and not only that, but I could even feel like. Those like 40 milliseconds started to feel like a long time as a fencer, which is sort of hard to imagine.
I was wondering, does that play with your sense of time in other areas? Do you just feel more sensitive to time overall?
Well, I've retired from fencing. Especially competitive fencing. Like 8 years ago. I haven't fenced at all hardly in the last 8 years, and so. I'm rusty, and likewise my timing I think is, sort of lagged back to normal. But I remember, a number of years ago, I was at some science museum, actually I think in Vancouver, Canada, and they had some reflex tester where the light, a light board goes off and you just have to tap the different lights. And I'm like, oh, this should be in my wheelhouse. Like I have fast reflexes from fencing. Let me try this. And so. I tried it once and, I did good, but not great. I'm like, oh, I'm disappointed. I can do way better. So I did it again. I literally was like 3,000ths of a second short of the record on that machine for the day or whatever. And I'm like, okay, let me try it again. I'm going to set the record on this. My wife's like, come on, honey. Like, we got to go. And I'm like, fine. Nobody cares. But yeah.
But you were that close to the record though on your second try.
Yeah. No, I was 3,000ths of a second short of the record for the thing. And I'm like, I'm going to get there. Like,
Yeah, really.
So
That's cool. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. But it's also like, I think, like a proprioception, like you feel your, control of your body and the timing of moving your own body and being that sharp and that fast and that quick and being able to change direction and make decisions. I mean, obviously I'm nowhere close. Don't get me wrong. I'm nowhere close to the athlete of like Allen Iverson. I mean, if Allen Iverson was a fencer, he would smoke me for sure. But after 10 years of practice, mind you, if he picked up a foil, I would crush him today.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think you might have a chance for a while.
No, until he practiced enough. But if he were a committed fencer, he would just light anybody up. But that his crossover, the way he leans one way and the other, and he breaks people's ankles, and he changes directions and changes tempo, like fencing is just like that. And so, fencing historically hasn't had like a lot of great natural athletes in it because it's an amateur sport. There's clearly no fame or notoriety or money to be made in it, and so it does not draw from the deepest talent pool. But
yeah, speaking back to that, getting into an easier niche.
Right. But it's the same kind of thing though, in terms of making very quick split-second decisions and having a sense of rhythm that is sort of staccato and offbeat, and knowing when to change tempo and direction.
Yeah, so let me. I'll do a little monologue here because I was reading last night about some studies related to fencing, and I found a couple of interesting ones that pertain to this. So there was a 2016 study some people in Germany did. It was published in the Psychology of Sport and Exercise publication, and it talked about. It showed how expert and non-expert fencers predicted maneuvers. They call it, and they call it action anticipation is the official term that scientists use. So they showed audio and video of fencing footage to expert and non-expert fencers, and as you'd expect, the experts did better at watching short clips of videos and predicting what the next, what the next result would be, where the impact would land, or what the action would be, and they did better, with very short clips of video, and just did better earlier on at predicting what the result would be. So that was an interesting one. And then that one also linked to another study from it was a 2010 study that tracked the eye movements of expert fencers, basically seeing how their eyes moved when they were fencing. And they found that the best fencers compared to the non-expert fencers focused mainly on the upper trunk of their opponent and the weapon kind of in that area. And they also showed that when those areas were covered on the video, they performed worse at predicting the action. So it wasn't just peripheral vision. In other words, they were actually like getting information about the intent of the opponent based on their trunk, upper trunk area, and where they held their weapon. Something about that area was, obviously the focal point. So that was kind of interesting. And then let's see. One other interesting thing about that was, shorter eye fixations. So they call fixations when you move your eye and stop. They call those fixations, and they found that fencing masters and experts had shorter eye fixations than did novices. Novices would look at places longer, basically, when they were fencing, whereas the experts were moving their eyes all over the place, which was actually interesting because in a lot of endeavors, it's the opposite, that experts do more of a peripheral vision kind of thing and have longer fixations. So it was kind of interesting, and it must be related to how quick the decision points are in fencing, that you have to move your eyes around a lot and take in a lot of information. So I just wanted to mention those two studies. I don't really expect a response unless you have something interesting to say there, or I could just keep moving on.
Well, I mean, I think those things are all true. I mean, they're all consistent with my experience.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it definitely seems to be the case that it's a lot of it is about, a big part of fencing obviously is about that predicting of the intent of an opponent, and just seems pretty clear that there must be so much unconscious and physical memory built in when you're so experienced that you just instinctually know, like, oh, this is probably going to be what happens here based on this guy's skill level and what I've seen him do before. And, yeah.
Well, back to the distinction we were trying to make earlier, sort of in-game versus metagame. I mean, this may not even be the best terminology for it, but the I mean, so much of training, of fencing practice is reading their attack as it comes and choosing correctly what to do about it, or conversely attacking, see which defense they're picking and up, which and countering their defense in real time. And so you have to train your neural pathways, both the ones in your brain, but also your motor neuron pathways in order to execute the action. And so it's so much about pattern recognition, and a short decision tree, that it becomes so you have to ingrain that faster and faster and faster. But the other side of the coin, though, is like between touches. I mean, like my fencing coach would say, like if we were fencing about I might say for fun, but really he's trying to instruct me, and subtly in a variety of ways while we're fencing each other. He would hit me and I wouldn't have done anything yet. I'd go back to start up for the next touch and he would say, now don't parry, and he'd mention like the parry number that I had in mind. And like already he knows like I'm thinking of this next parry to counter his action. And he's already telling me, don't pick that one because I already know, I know you think that. And so, I mean, there is he's now leveraging his vast experience to describe his metagame knowledge.
Right.
So there's
really getting in your head there.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there's a good amount of intellectual. That's what I was kind of wondering is like when you actually get ready, to start the bout, like how much of it is intellectual, like I'm going to do this versus how much of it is like I'm going to adapt to what happens, And I guess it sounds like, yeah, you're saying there's a good amount of metagame and taking into account some intellectual stuff that going in, based on what you know about this player or this fencer.
There's definitely some. I mean, I would say it leans more towards in-game, reaction time based on the years of training you've done to develop your reflexes, correctly, hopefully. You have to rely on that first and foremost because that's, thousands of hours of practice. But there certainly is a certain amount of analysis done before matches to identify tendencies, strategizing of, what are their favorite moves? What's the best way for me to counter those moves? Does this person like to change up their moves, or does this person just stick stubbornly with whatever works best for them and they don't change much? Those kinds of things.
So would there be a lot of studying of the game tapes of other opponents, like in a serious competition? You would watch, if it existed, you would watch some of that footage and study their moves.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, especially to identify, people's favorite moves and then what they would do off of those moves. I mean, some people, they love to flick to the hand. Other people love to, attack deep to the body. Some people like to counter and draw you out first. So, you could easily identify those kinds of tendencies. And then you could try to see, next level, okay, if their best move is taken away from them, what do they go to next, so that, you can be ready with their first order changes.
So this reminded me, watching the footage of how quick some of the touches happen. I was wondering why it doesn't just, and I guess you answered this a little bit earlier, but I was wondering why it doesn't just devolve into a kind of game theory optimal solution of just like lunging as fast as possible at the other person. And I guess you explained this, that, in Epi, for example, you can deflect that more easily and just, counter, you can parry it and then hit them more easily. Would you say that's the main reason why? Because it seems like, it's such a quick action to lunge at somebody and try to hit them, and it seems like so many of the touches happen that way, like just both people lunging at each other. So I kind of wondered why, it didn't devolve to that.
Well, so Saber in particular, it does somewhat devolve to that. I mean, that's part of the problem Saber has. That's why they took away the crossover step. That's what they're trying to sharpen the timing in Saber. They've actually changed the mechanical box timing to reduce the number of double touches in Saber. Because Saber and foil timings are much wider because you have right of way. Someone is granted the initiative of the attack. If I start my attack, you quickly hit me first, and then I hit you second. Even though I hit you second, it's still my point because you never negated my attack, which I started first. And so that timing between when you hit me first and when I hit you second has been shortened, especially in saber, so that I don't have all day to finish my attack. I have to finish my attack within, I don't know, 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds or something. I don't know the exact number.
So they are trying to present basically more obstacles to make it a more of a skill game.
Well, and more balanced, as you say. Like it becomes unbalanced. Like saber, historically has been unbalanced towards offense, and epee somewhat has been unbalanced towards defense. I mean, and especially compared to saber, epee looks wildly unbalanced to defense, and so all the saber people love to say how boring and dull epee is, by comparison. But I mean, I fenced epee a long time, and I believe that it's only faintly unbalanced towards defense, and that there's still plenty of offense in epee. But the criticism is somewhat valid, and so yeah, in epee there's a lot of feinting of people not wanting to go. And so I remember, for example, my main teammate that I trained with, who I say I finished 7th alternate for the Olympics. He actually made the Olympic team in 2004, and went to Athens. He actually loved to attack on offense in epee, but he was also, at least for fencers, a pretty gifted athlete. I mean, he was 6'4", very explosive, could dunk easily. And so his attack, he had this long, fast attack that was just very hard to slow down. And so he would just steamroll guys, and if they parried or they, counterattacked, I mean, he'd have to adjust, from time to time. And, but he had no problem just launching an attack. And then also, I guess, just by nature, it was, I didn't want to really attack unless I was sure it was going to work. And so I almost, as a consequence, almost never attacked. I mean, by choice, I would try to draw people out. I would feint.
Let them come to.
Yeah, and then, so I would feint a lot. Try to draw their counter, and then I would counter their counter. That was my standard game. And so, I remember a tournament that we both had in Las Vegas together, where I was fencing this guy who was, not at my skill level, but I'm trying to draw him out, and he's, not wanting to attack me for obvious reasons, both because it's my strength, but also because, he doesn't mind a low-scoring game in order to increase the variance. And my training partner is like, dude, what are you doing playing like a low-scoring game with this guy? Go steamroll this guy. And I'm like, I don't think I want to. Like, that's not what I do. And so, I slowly drew him out, and I finally got like a one-touch lead. And then as slowly as time started to expire, he was forced to try to attack me. And then, bam, I just, slammed the door in his face and lit him up. And I ended up beating him like, 15-3 or whatever. But all my 15 touches, 14 of them were scored in the last minute of the 9 minutes or whatever. And that first touch took me 8 minutes to score or whatever. And so, he was just shaking his head. It's like, you could have done that in 3 minutes. I'm like, well, you could have done that in 3 minutes. It takes me the whole 9 minutes to get there.
Right, yeah. Hey, slow and steady. Wins the race sometimes. I was going to say, the strip that you fence on, is there a penalty? Do you lose a point if you go off the edge? Is that how that works?
So if you go off the edge sideways, there's no real penalties. It's just sort of out of bounds, and they just sort of reset. You're actually forced to like lose distance. So, I mean, there's a faint penalty. And if you step off, on purpose in order to like dodge someone's attack, that actually is a penalty. You'll be, docked a point or whatever.
Gotcha.
The key thing though is that you get pushed off the back. As soon as you have both feet pushed off the back of the strip, then the other person gets a point.
It's like a sumo element to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, people who love to defend like I do, I love to counter, I would actually push. I'd push people to the end of the strip. And then once they run out of room, they can't run away anymore. Now when I push into them, they have to attack into me because they can't retreat anymore. And that's, now they've attacked me, now I can counter like I'm hoping to.
Yeah. So I was wondering how realistic or how similar, in your opinion, is fencing to like a real life sword battle, like life or death sword battle? How much would it be similar to that?
Short answer is not very similar because, I mean, most swords are basically two-handed weapons, would you say? I mean, I guess if you had like a short sword, you could, poke with it one-handed. I mean, supposedly epee came from rapier, a French 17th century dueling weapon. But I mean, those, a real blade doesn't bend at all, first of all. And every blade that I picked up has been sort of, to me at least, I mean, surprisingly heavy relative to the fencing weapons. I guess I'll put it the other way. Fencing weapons are surprisingly light.
Mhm.
They're pretty, you know, they're pretty thin and they're not that substantial. Like, I mean, they break actually, I mean, they break fairly frequently. Like,
Mm.
I mean, when I was training a lot, I would break an epee probably once a month and have to buy a new one. I mean, I just had, a dozen of them or half dozen sitting around all the time. Um,
Yeah, I guess it wouldn't.
because
I guess it wouldn't be that similar. The more that I think about it, because it's you can't just obviously you can't just touch somebody in an actual life or death sword fight. You have to.
Well, and so that's where the foil people and the saber people with the right of way, they'll just say, "Ha, epee is silly." You're going to poke them on the finger, and then they're going to stab you in the chest, and you're going to say, "While you're dying," but I hit them first, and so there, with having only the torso or upper body be valid target and being forced to defend against someone else's attack. Okay, okay, someone attacks me. I've really made them miss. Now I'm going to hit them. They claim that's somewhat more realistic. It's not entirely true. Because you parried them, but then they stabbed you before you delivered your second attack.
I was gonna say that seems a
You're
little.
not afforded that right of way, actually. So not the short answer is I don't think it would help me very much. I mean, I remember one day, at the office, some friend of mine was like peeling a banana and peeled off the sticker of his Chiquita banana and then like stuck it on me like just I don't know what possessed him, but he's like stuck it on the middle of my chest, and I'm like, dude, you just called out the wrong guy. And like sticker fight, here we go. So we each got a sticker, and like we're circling each other, and he went to stick me, and I just parried him and stuck the sticker right on his chest. And I'm like, never call out a fencer to a sticker fight. So if it's a sticker fight, fencing will definitely help you.
Real life applications, yes.
Yes, exactly.
I'd imagine you'd have to have some good advantage though, in a hand to hand sword or stick or pole battle. Yeah, I'd imagine.
Well, so I mean, I remember years ago I read the biography of Peter Westbrook, who was the best American fencer in the 80s. And in his biography, he talked about I don't know. I mean, he was from New York, being on the subway, and some guy I don't know, crazy guy giving him the eye, like about to throw down or whatever. I don't quite know all the details, but he felt confident based on being an elite fencer that he could dodge this guy's punch and hit him back or just evade him or whatever. And so
I'd imagine so.
Yeah. So I mean,
some
the
good
problem
reaction
is
times and good response to things swinging at you and good reaction times in general. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, and also being sensitive to distance. Whether someone's too close or not close enough. It's you develop certainly a very heightened sensitivity to that from fencing. Of what those 2 inches actually matter a lot in fencing. So you become very sensitive to that. But in terms of if a fencer got thrown into a boxing match, I mean, most fencers can't really throw a punch very well. So I don't think they'd actually do well as boxers, but they could probably dodge a couple punches and run away.
Yeah, and they'd probably be able to get up to speed a lot easier than most people, I'm sure. Yeah, practicing a lot. Yeah. So I was wondering about there's kind of like this myth. It's probably well explained now, but the myth of left-handed fencers being better. Can you explain that idea?
Well, it's certainly true that left-handed fencers have proportionally much better results than right-handed fencers. Um, but I mean, it stems pretty much entirely from left-handers having a lot of practice against right-handers and right-handers not having very much practice against left-handers.
Right. That makes sense.
So when you have opposite stance fencers, their blades are like touching each other almost all the time, and so you just get a lot more blade contact, and the actions are all blade contact heavy. And when you have same stance fencers, their blades don't touch each other very much, and so you have a lot of sort of actions without much blade contact. And so left-handed fencers are used to having a lot more blade contact on average, I would say, and that's why they're used to that. But my main training partner, I mean, I was the main training partner for him too. I mean, granted, we were part of a big club, but we were the 2 best fencers at that club, and so we fenced each other the most. I mean, we would travel to World Cups and big tournaments overseas, and he remembered like he had a group stage where I didn't want to say like 4 out of the 5 people in his group were all left-handed, and he felt very comfortable and I think beat them all because he and I fenced each other every day. So if you're used to fencing left-handed people, it's no big deal. But if you're not used to it, it definitely isn't a disadvantage for you.
So it could be one of those factors if you were thinking about getting into fencing because you thought it was a good fairly low competition niche. Then maybe being left-handed might be another factor to like get you to go into it. Would you say that's accurate?
Sure. I mean, I know not very many, but one or two people who were right-handed, and they decided that they should fence left-handed for that very reason. And then they came to regret it later, but they're already too late. They've already been fencing left-handed for like 7 years, and like it was too late to switch.
Why'd they regret it?
They just felt like at the highest level, they just wish they were using their strong arm against,
They needed more. Yeah, they ended up thinking it'd be better to have more optimal control over.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one they knew best. Yeah. Huh.
I mean, there's someone. Go ahead.
Oh no, you have anything else to say on that? I was just going to move on.
Oh, I mean, this is sort of off topic also, but I mean, I was going to make some poker and fencing analogies, sort of.
Oh, sure. Love to hear any of those.
Well, so I mean, I retired from fencing about 8 years ago, and around 6 years ago, I started doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and so I mean, I hope that my fencing training would help me learn a new martial art, but jiu-jitsu is submission grappling with no striking, and it's very. I mean, there's a lot of friction. I wear the gi, the funny pajamas, and fencing has basically helped me almost not at all.
Mm.
But the process of becoming a good fencer, showing up to practice every day and thinking about it and working hard, I feel like that's the one thing that sort of translated over, where I listen to my coach's advice and I try to do what he tells me to, and I practice and I try to learn more sensitivity. But jiu-jitsu is much more complicated than fencing. There's so many more moves and so many more positions and so many more different kinds of attacks in jiu-jitsu than there are in fencing, that even after doing jiu-jitsu for 6 years, I'm still learning basic attacks. I mean, I know the basic ones, but the not quite so basic ones, I'm still barely learning them. I can still barely do them. And I still feel far from using any of the strategic concepts that I learned in fencing, of being unpredictable, of changing my attacks, of reading my opponent's reactions. I still barely use any of that in jiu-jitsu. I mean, I read their body weight, which way they're leaning. I read that, to try to topple them this way or that way, sweep them this way or that way. But my proficiency with the actions themselves is still not really good enough to be super advanced strategically. And I just had this realization literally last night while I was thinking about, our discussions preparing for this interview. When I started playing poker, everybody played Hold'em, and I played Hold'em, and I read books on Hold'em and watched Hold'em on TV, and would play, cash games and sit and goes and whatever. And so it wasn't long before, ideas of, range balancing and identifying if people are calling stations or lag tards or whatever, they had huge imbalances one way or the other, and exploiting that was real natural for me. And it was in that kind of environment that, I mean, everybody, seemed like they were trying to, like, read tells and would look for physical indications. But in the last probably 5 years, I've barely played any Hold'em. The home games that I play now are all dealer's choice mixed games, like crazy Omaha variants or a lot of high-low variants. And I actually realized, even though I've been playing with the same people for the last 5 years, like, I don't really know their tells very well, which is sort of embarrassing in some ways. But on the other hand, it's like there's so many different games, and I play all of them, fairly badly. Like, I'm still trying to decide, like, a 6-card Omaha, whether I should play this draw or not, or whatever.
Oh God, you're playing that crazy stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, some fun home games. Yeah, I always like that about home games. Just call these crazy games that are so hard to figure out, or just so wacky. Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like the wide variety of mixed games that I'm playing now is more like jiu-jitsu for me, where just being able to have like a basic, solid, fundamental game without, that doesn't play too much trash in it, is enough to win. And, and like, really, like, I mean, no one bluffs pre-flop in Omaha anyways, because even bad hands are getting the right odds to call. And so, I mean, here and there, people try to pick off the occasional river bluff, but like I feel like bluff catching is not really
It's more about
how do I even try to make money.
solid. Yeah, just more about solid fundamentals
Yeah,
in
very
general. Yeah.
fundamental. Like having a two-way hand in high-low games and drawing to the nuts in Omaha and things like that.
You had mentioned something funny when you said you went from fencing to playing more poker, and how going from the high decision, how fast the decisions were in fencing to how slow poker was a bit of a struggle.
Well, the worst part about it, I mean, it was absolutely a struggle. And the worst part of the struggle was that if in fencing you identify somebody's tendency that they do something too often and you're going to exploit them, only takes a few seconds to set up the actions necessary to bring them to that situation so that you can, exploit the tendency you observed. But in poker, if you say, okay, this person's a calling station, I know they're going to call me down wide, I'm going to value bet light. I mean, to have a hand good enough to value bet might take an hour.
Right, right.
It's so frustrating to wait, to get your bluff
Yeah.
picked off by some calling station. Like, okay, I'm going to get them next time. I'm going to value bet thin, and then seriously, the next time you're both in a pot and you have a better hand than them and you can value bet thin, it might be the next day. I mean, who
Yeah,
knows?
or you think you got a good tell, and you're like, well, maybe I'll get to use that tomorrow. I don't know, or maybe a week from now if I get to play with him again. Who knows? That would take some building up of patience for sure. Yeah. Any other analogies spring to mind, or any other like exciting anecdotes where in a fencing match you got a good read on someone? Anything like that
Well,
spring
I
to mind?
remember a woman, I mean, she was a young woman who trained at my fencing club, um, who used like a false tell. She always did like a double feint attack, and her first feint was really bad, and it was so bad that everyone knew that it was a feint, and no one was ever fooled by it. And then they would expect the next action to be her attack because there was her feint, and so they would just jump on her next action. But her next action was her good feint, and so she would just fool everyone with her good feint because her first feint was so bad. So bad feint, good feint, and then hit you, and it was just a shocker how many people fell for this. And then even after I saw it and got hit by it, I'm like, okay, don't bite on the first feint, don't bite on the second feint. Wait for the third attack. The third one's the real attack. And I would just find myself. I mean, it was a battle. Like that first bad feint sold the second feint so well that it was just a struggle to not fall for the false tell that she gave.
So I was gonna say, like, even knowing, I was thinking initially like you would immediately know to not fall for that, but you're saying it would probably have a few uses because you were so instinctually not used to it.
Well, I mean, people train their instincts, and so if you can, trigger their instinct, they're gonna snap at it for the most part. I mean, and so I mean, that was the other thing that my head coach would do is he would play all these games where you had to inhibit your instinct so that you have to turn your instinct on when you wanted to, but inhibit it when you didn't want to. And so, like Simon Says, for example, we would play Simon Says, and then he'd make some fencing action where you're supposed to do the counter action, and he would say Simon Says sometimes, but it wouldn't say it the other times. And he'd catch people all the time where Simon didn't say go do push-ups or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
things like that, or other variations like that. I mean,
Getting you to be more conscious about your decisions as opposed to instinctual. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so, I mean, I remember hearing some podcast about I don't know, like old-fashioned lure ties, where each rod and gun club in England would have its own special tie for salmon fishing, and it would have like peacock feathers and bird of paradise feathers and whatever. And each club's special tie was like fancier than the other clubs. And after a while, you're like, man, like there's an arms race between these clubs that have the fanciest ties. Like maybe there's an arms race among salmon, like to not to bite these flies, and it requires a really special one to hook a salmon. And you get this predator prey arms race, only to find like no, salmon are dumb. Like you just drop like a piece of tinfoil, they'll hit that. Like
Right.
you don't need anything.
Don't need to overthink it.
Right. So you don't need anything fancy to catch salmon, and the fancy ties are just to impress other people apparently. Um, and so, fencing, a lot of fencers are very instinctual, and they have no sort of second order game theory or no second order leveling of thought, and they just do what they've been trained to do. And other fencers, very cerebral, or they're able to inhibit their reactions, and they're always thinking a step ahead, and they can change their game. They can fence a completely different style. And that's where my head coach, I thought, was really impressive. He would take different people who just naturally had different personalities and would create a whole different fencing game for them based on their personality. And so that's where, again, my training partner, who was super impulsive and aggressive and athletic, was able to get away with a really aggressive attacking style in epee. And I'm more deliberate and strategic, and my coach helped me develop a really patient counter game, trying to draw people out and put different levels of indirection into it and stuff. But there were times when, my coach still worked on me to improve my attacks. He would, we would work together, and he would, give me a slight signal. He'd make a small mistake in his distance, in his body positioning, in his weight transfer. That would be my signal to attack. And if I missed it, he would yell at me or make me do push-ups or punish me, so that I would raise my excitation levels, so I'd be ready to jump on those flaws when I saw them and not miss them. It's like he said, against good opponents, you're not going to see many mistakes. You have to exploit them when you can. And so even though I had a defensive style, that tournament that I had my best result at, where I finished third, I made the semifinals and lost in the semifinals. My match in the quarterfinals that I won in order to get into the semifinals, that match was against somebody who also was fairly defensive, had a strong defensive game. And so, I knew that. So I planned to sort of just like nibble on the outside, not commit to any of my attacks, just attack short, like to the hand or to maybe the knee or the toe. And it didn't work. Like, he still was better at countering, and he scored and got up on me. And then because I was behind, I was forced to attack. It's like, if you're behind in football, you got to throw. And so it's like, it was bad in the sense that, like, now I have to attack, something I'm not that good at. He's going to defend, something he's already shown he's very proficient at. And yet I was able to just pull off my best attacks of my career. And I lit this guy up and got the lead again. And then he was forced to attack because he was behind and time was running out. And my defense was, better than his offense. And I was able to hold him off and win. And so I was really proud of actually winning a match on my offense against a strong, defensive player, because, and I credit my coach of working on my offense, even though I was primarily a defensive fencer. I also remember a match like I had in Cuba. I was fencing a World Cup in Havana, and I had planned an attack, and I was literally executing my attack. I was in the middle of this attack, and my opponent, put in a really great counter right in the middle of my attack and surprised me. And yet, even though I was surprised, did not see it coming at all, did not expect it, I was able to pull off a counter to his counter in literally like the smallest amount of time in my whole career, and was able to score in that moment. Unfortunately, he still beat me in that match, but that was probably the fastest change of decision. Because my coach would talk a lot about like a change of decision where you have 2 or 3 choices, and you're just going to see what your opponent does and you're going to choose the right choice, versus a change of decision where you weren't planning to make a decision. Like, you were surprised that a decision was even necessary. That obviously takes a lot longer. Your reaction time is going to be slower in that context. And so I feel like that was like my fastest ever change of decision, being surprised and still choosing correctly.
Right. A great moment to adjusting to unknown behavior. Yeah. That got me thinking, as much as you can talk about the various levels of thinking and in fencing or poker, it's kind of like when it gets down to it, there's only so many levels in practice, because, when it comes down to it, there's going to be a few decisions in the moment really quickly, and you're not going to be thinking on these multiple levels, which is kind of true in poker too. Like, it gets very confusing to think beyond, he thinks that I think he has this, these kind of multiple levels. But
sure,
when you get down to the practice, it's like it's a lot simpler than that, because you can't think too many moves ahead.
Well, it's circular, so kind of like rock paper scissors. If you go 4 levels ahead in rock paper scissors, you're back at 1 level. Right. If you go rock and then paper and then scissors and then back to rock, you're back at rock. It's not any different than if you just went 1 level. So
right.
There aren't that many levels out there before you get back to where you started. My favorite quote in poker, I think it was Greg Raymer, made it against Paul Magriel. He said, my opponent is either a genius or an idiot, and it's my job to figure out which.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a good quote. Yeah. Yeah, this has been great. Any other things come to mind? One thing I wanted to ask was how, if people wanted to get in touch with you about anything. Do you have any thing you want to mention or ways to contact you?
Well, I mean, certainly anyone can, I guess, email me. It's old fashioned these days, but Seth.Baldwin at Gmail. And definitely, if anyone's interested in fencing, they should come on down to the Northwest Fencing Center in Beaverton. You can find them at nwfencing.org.
And you're on. Are you training there, or do you teach there, or you're on the board of
I have
directors?
taught there. I also served on the board of directors there. I am officially retired, although about a month ago I started taking my daughter there. She's 8 and started their kids class there. She doesn't really like it yet, unfortunately. She says, "Dad, everyone there's better than me." I'm like, "Well, they've all been coming here longer than you, so that's okay."
After learning more about it, it definitely seems like a pretty cool sport to get into. I mean, I'm more interested now than I was a few days ago. So this has been
It's a
cool,
great
cool to
workout.
learn about.
I mean, it's fun. It's like it's fast paced. There's a lot of decisions to make. There's a lot of strategic ideas you can have, and it's quick. It's not boring. There's no waiting an hour to get a hand. I mean, it's a lot more action packed than poker, that's for sure, and a much better workout. So it's definitely better for you. The only downside is you can't make any money in fencing.
Yeah, I was gonna say you also have some. Seth has some videos on YouTube also where you're teaching some fencing maneuvers too, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty proud of that. It's a instructional series I put together probably 5, 6 years ago now. Seth K. Baldwin is my YouTube channel. My training partner that I mentioned, Cody Mattern, he's the epee coach now at the Northwest Fencing Center. He and I demo some fencing basics. I mean, when I was beginning in fencing did seem confusing to me. It did seem like there were a lot of moves and there was a lot of moving parts to keep track of, and but I felt like there should be some like grand unifying theory to fencing that would explain everything. I felt like that would be out there, and it took me a long time to find it. It took me at least 10 years of fencing to really get a good understanding of it, but I did. And the basic understanding of it is you just have to control distance. You have to get away when you want to, and you have to collapse the distance when you want to. And if your opponent doesn't want you to collapsing distance becomes harder, but you have to like sort of wrong foot them. You have to get them going the wrong way. You have to surprise them. You have to vary the size of steps that you make, the tempo of steps that you make, the rhythm of steps that you make. And so I put a series together on that with Cody, explaining just the sort of the basics on just a little bit on how to do that and how to counterattack in epee.
Nice. Seth, do you have anything else random you want to mention before we?
Short answer is no. But I mean, I'm curious to learn more about your work in the long run. I mean, I've read your books, although I haven't finished your last book. I feel guilty to admit I should finish it at least. And I feel like the game that I play in, but I mean, that's sort of the monologue I guess I was having, or dialogue with myself. Is that possible? Internal dialogue I was having about like why don't I know the tells of the people that I play with, because I've seen them twice a week for 5 years now. But I think the answer is because we play all these wacky dealer choice games, and and literally nobody knows what they're doing. And
Yeah.
so
When people don't take it seriously, yeah, I think I'd say that when people don't take poker seriously, it's pretty hard to read them. But also, I'd say, yeah, I think another element is like when you have the fundamental abilities to beat the game pretty easily, you're not really as focused as much on getting like little edges either. So you're probably just like, well, I don't need it, and I'm having fun. So
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. And in Hold'em, I mean, I was, obviously, bad players today are much better than bad players from 10 years ago. And so, I think those edges are a lot more necessary.
Yeah, I'd say the verbal. I will say like the verbal book is the one I'm the most proud of because I also think it has the most application for like home game kind of.
Oh yeah, I know. That's why I was so excited.
Yeah, I mean that's the one. That's the one I am the most proud of because I think when you're able to get those reads, they're so much more powerful than so much more reliable than the physical ones.
Well, I mean, ask your opinion then. So, I mean, I have the habit from Hold'em of being, very stoic when I bet. I mean, I don't really talk much. I mean, I don't talk at all, first of all, during during a hand, and I just try to stay neutral and I don't really do anything. And then like I feel like, I mean, that's largely carried over to this home game. But I feel like that's like the wrong way to go. Now that I think about it, everybody else
Too
is like,
serious.
yeah, it's a little too serious for this
Yeah,
home
yeah.
game. Like people are there to have fun, and then if I'm quiet and never talk, I mean, I do talk, I crack jokes or whatever. But if I'm too stoic during hands, and people,
Makes them more stoic. Yeah.
yeah, or just makes me less fun to play with. I mean, I think being
Right.
fun to play with is literally the most important skill in this
No, I
whole
completely agree. That was, yeah. I mean, I agree. I mean, like, I think I'm a big proponent of talking during hands. It just pays to know, what you can say, what you can't say, and I'm a big proponent of like not seeming like making the game less fun is not a good thing. And yeah, so I made sure to put that in verbal poker tells where I'm like, I think it's a good thing to talk and be loose. You just want to know what you potentially are giving away. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna think about that and maybe try talking
Especially,
during hand.
yeah, especially home games. You're like, you want everybody to have a good time and
Yeah.
not seem to be taking it too seriously.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
these people, I mean, it's fine to be competitive. Like
Mhm.
that's not a problem. They're all there to bust
They're
each other's
competitive
chops,
too.
and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's fine to needle each other and whatever. Um, but in a fun, joshy sort of way, not anything mean or too dull. Conversely, on the other side of that coin. So I'm going to try to maybe load up some verbal barbs and see if I can.
Don't wear your sunglasses and scarf and headphones.
Oh no, it's really not that. I mean, it's bad enough, looking at my phone between hands, but I mean, each hand takes 3.5 minutes to play or whatever. Like,
Poker is slow. I was just thinking the other day, it'd be nice to have think of variants where you're playing like multiple hands because I've played like in home games, played like everybody plays two hands and you can raise yourself, for like.
that sounds all right. That sounds
Yeah. It
like
was kind of
collusion right there.
just like trying to think of ways formats to make it like less boring. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, people have called double barrel, I guess, or like two boards or whatever. I mean, I've heard all sorts of wacky versions, and I don't play any games that offer like two boards simultaneously. But isn't like in a lot of like Dramaha where there's like Omaha draw
Oh yeah,
combo, or I
I
mean,
barely even know what that is. Yeah, there's so many.
it's 5 card draw hand wins half the pot, and the Omaha hand wins the other half the pot. No, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad, and it's terrible because the draw takes so long. I mean, I mostly just call 5 card Omaha when it's my deal. Yeah, it's a one. I mean, it's a one person winner. It's not a split pot game the way all the high-low games are.
Oh, that's not the same as Big O, is it? Is that Big O?
No, it's high only. It's high only Big O.
Okay. Nice. Well, any other random thoughts? I think we're at a good point now.
Yeah, no, all good. Thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Thanks for mentioning my books at the end. I appreciate that too.
My pleasure. They're definitely a treasure trove and of useful information.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and it's been a very interesting talk, even more interesting than I thought it would be. So that's been awesome.
Great.
Okay.
Look forward to talking to you later. My pleasure.
All right, later.
This has been the People Who Read People podcast, hosted by Zachary Elwood. If you like this episode, consider subscribing to the podcast or giving it a rating or a review. Later, guys.